Okay, so now let's move to item 16, the hearings panel report to council on the draft Christchurch Central City parking policy. So we've got staff here for that. Now what I'm going to do is to invite Anne as the chair of the hearings panel and the author of the resolutions that are in front of us to make some introductory remarks to introduce this, and then I'll take some introductory comments from staff. Then we'll move to questions, and then obviously we'll debate and decide. So, Anne, if you'd like to introduce this as the chair of the hearings panel, please. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and commend our staff for the work that they've put into developing the Christchurch Central City parking policy, and my thanks also to my fellow panel members, Councillor Aaron Kewen, Councillor Mike Davidson and Councillor Yanni Johansson for their time and consideration of submissions. I would also like to thank each of the submitters who took the time and effort to provide their input. We received 87 written submissions on the draft policy and heard from 15 submitters when the hearings panel was convened in March and April earlier this year. If implemented, this policy will replace the Central City Parking Plan 2015. The 2015 parking plan was focused on earthquake recovery and short-term parking availability within the central city while rebuild progressed. As central city development has progressed, a new policy direction is desirable to balance competing interests for on-street space in the central city and ensure the parking policy aligns with this council's priorities and community outcomes. This is actually a complex policy area where there are competing interests for the use of the same space for different users, by different users. To provide sufficient flexibility to address these issues, I think it is important to appreciate this policy provides a framework that will enable staff to make operational decisions and, if necessary, further guidance from us. Submissions received by the hearings panel reflected the competing interests for use of on-street spaces between residents, commuters, visitors, guests, utility and service providers, and mobility users. Submissions often advocated for outcomes that supported a submitter's interests and facilitated use of parking spaces for their needs. Some matters raised by submitters that are worth noting and that could direct future actions by council were: there is an increasing demand for on-street and off-street parking spaces by residents who live in the central city but have no off-street parking provided by the developer of the apartment complex. 2, monitoring and enforcement of parking infringements by council officers is important to ensure people comply with parking restrictions. 3, to reduce friction between the competing interests of users, it was suggested variable timing for signs for on-street parking should be explored, i.e. time restricted during business hours and unrestricted overnight. It is important for council, this is 4, it is important for council to increase the supply of EV charging infrastructure as the uptake of EVs increases. The hearings panel was provided with evidence showing the unsafe practices that can occur when insufficient infrastructure is provided. We saw pictures of an extension cord running from an apartment across the berm and into an EV parked on the roadside. 5, a minimum of 1 mobility parking space per apartment complex and/or block should be implemented. Our residents need clear and accessible information about where mobility parking spaces are and how to access them. 6, more cycle and scooter parking infrastructure will support uptake of these active transport modes. And 7, there was support for council to consider reintroducing a shuttle within the 4 avenues to facilitate people movement and reduce reliance on private motor vehicles. After hearing submissions, the hearings panel asked staff a number of questions. Some of those questions were deemed operational or questions that were outside the scope of the policy. I have recorded these matters in paragraph 6.3 of the report, and the responses staff provided to those questions are included in attachment A of my report. As the hearings panel was unable to reach a majority decision, and after taking staff advice to confirm it is appropriate to do so, I have included a chairperson's recommendation in the report for your consideration. My chairperson's recommendation reflects that no concerns within the scope of the policy were raised by the hearings panel. You will also see that paragraph 2 of my recommendation requests staff undertake further work to understand the role of off-street parking spaces play in the central city. This recommendation was proposed by my fellow panellist, Councillor Davidson, and will mean policy 11 can be removed and be replaced with a direction from this council but for staff to undertake a review the role of off-street parking in the central city. I think this is particularly important to further inform our understanding of how off-street parking is used in the central city. I am pleased to endorse the hearings panel report on the central city parking policy. My recommendation as chair and to encourage elected members to vote for its adoption. Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed. And thanks for the report, for the recommendations and the work that you've done on this, and for the comments that you've just made. Thank you. So are there any comments that staff wanted to make by way of introduction before we move to questions?
I think that was very comprehensive. Thank you. Just to reiterate that this is a decision-making tool, so it's a bit of guidance for operational decision-making rather than making the decisions itself. And just to reiterate as well that policy 11 has been excluded from this, just to acknowledge that further work is required, and the proposal is to bring back a scope at the end of this year so that we can do more work on that.
So that scope will then come back to where?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, where will that come back to?
UD&T.
Yeah.
Urban Development and Transport Committee.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And by the end of the year.
Yes, correct.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, Anne, you referred to paragraph 6.3 of the report in your commentary. So I would draw members' attention to 6.3, and in particular in deciding on any questions that you might like to ask. Matters raised by the hearings panel after reading and receiving submissions that are operational or outside the scope of the draft policy are obviously listed at 6.3. I wouldn't expect for that reason any questions to be raised on those matters in this meeting today. And if there are any questions that slip through the net that are out of scope or operational in nature, I would invite staff to make that clear, so that we don't spend our time today talking about things that are outside of policy. We just deal with matters that are pertinent and relevant to the policy that's in front of us, the draft policy that's in front of us. So having said that, let me now move to questions. Tim.
I don't know whether it's a question for staff or yourself, but with regards to 6.3.6, or on page 216, with regards to the power cords and EVs, it is a question that should be, and something that should be discussed and worked out, because technically I can't see it being an illegal thing if you've got the RCDs, etc. But if our answer as a council is, let's just put some more charging stations in at the cost of all ratepayers, I don't think that's it. I think it is something that we do have to start to address and have a proper policy on.
Yep.
So sorry, just to confirm, you're raising the question around the cables going across the footpath. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, it would, to be able to do that, you'd have to get a corridor access request signed off or approved by council, which we wouldn't approve for that situation. And also you'd need, probably technically, you'd need a temporary traffic management plan as well, which we wouldn't approve. So,
And all of that's outside of this policy?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
So if, for instance, you're doing something on the berm, cutting a bit of wood or whatever, and you've got a skill set saw, you've got a cable, and you've got an RCD at the house end, you've got your cable, you've got some, bit of cover on it, and you're doing something. What's the difference between that and parking your car outside and just? I think there's got to be. But our answer to that, and according to this, is actually looking at more EV stations, which is ridiculous. It is.
Okay,
Yeah,
so realising that we're talking about something which is exactly what I talked about prior, which is we're now questioning something that's outside of the policy. Yes, it may be something that is worthy of discussion, but it's not relevant to the policy.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. All right, Yanni.
Thanks. On 6.41, how did the hearing panel consider and deliberate on a matter that was approved after it had concluded in the LTP? Like 6.41 talks about the contestable EV charging fund and the 4.3 million put in the LTP, but we made that decision after the hearing panel had already finished its work.
So that's a fact, isn't it? That council created a contestable.
That paragraph is noting of the decision that's come.
Yeah, I just think it should be separated out as new information that's come after the hearing panel has concluded. I don't recall the hearing panel considering the 200,000 EV charging fund.
No. So let's acknowledge that the first part of that paragraph is about the discussion the hearings panel had, and the second part of that paragraph is a fact about something that happened after that discussion had taken place.
And there were discussions on the fees charged as well, so that might like to be reflected too, that council's also increased the car parking fees in the LTP.
All right. I mean, all of this is around the content of the report, not the substance of the decision that we're making.
Well, no, but I just think if we're going to accurately record what happened at the hearing panel, any new information should be separate from that process. And if some of it's going to be highlighted, then all of it should be highlighted.
Well, short of rewriting the report after we've made the decision on it, let's acknowledge that there are two parts to that paragraph 6.4.1, one of which relates to the discussion the hearings panel had, the other of which is something which happened after that, which is noted. And let's also note, rather than rewriting the report after the decision has been made, that council did make a decision on parking fees in the LTP.
So we'll do it as a secretarial note in the minutes.
Yeah.
So can I
do
just
that.
ask then under 6.45, so what are the measurements that we're going to know if this parking policy has been successful or not? Like, what are we going to monitor the parking policy against?
So just going back, so this is an operational tool to use for decision making. So part of the process will be around the gathering of information, which is one of the goals, is to actually increase the information that we have so that we can therefore use it. Part of that part there will just be actually the operational implementation of that, and that will be sitting with the operational team. So that's not part of this policy.
Right. So if we adopt it, how do we know what we're adopting is successful?
So it will be around the use of it. So this in itself is just an enabler. The way that we then subsequently use it will then obviously be the stuff that we will measure, and so that will come subsequent to this.
So if you take the example on the technology, where we've got a support and adopt advances in parking management technology, we talk about reducing operating costs, enhancing data collection and monitoring, and making it more customer friendly. People raise those matters in the submissions, and we've been told that that's out of scope, but we're going to adopt this policy, and then how are we going to know that, the technology that we're using is reduces operating costs and is easy to use?
That'll come through in the operational reports you receive from our transport team, so they'll be able to link that back to decisions that they've made under this policy.
So reporting to the relevant committee will be linked back to this policy where appropriate, so that we can see the effect the policy is having. And how it's been
So
implemented.
those decisions will be based on this framework.
And is policy 10, is that for council's operating costs? So the cost could be higher to the public and the community, but if it's lower for us, like a private company doing it rather than us, then that would be a success.
Sorry, let me find it.
Well, they could be reduced costs for both council and public.
Right.
Thank you.
And the only other thing I was going to check, so, obviously there was quite a few submissions that were concerned with the behaviour of private car parking operators. As I understand it from the advice that we've had, even though we've got no ability to control how those private operators work, the panel's still recommending that council operate a small number of off-street car parking facilities, and that we don't look to build any additional off-street car parking.
Correct.
So, in terms of if council wanted to if we wanted to provide parking for the hospital or...
Well, parking is being provided for the hospital. That's being consented at the moment, my understanding.
It hasn't been decided who's going to operate it, has it?
It's not.
Okay,
it's not
again, that's a
council.
specific around a particular parking building being provided. It's outside of the scope
Correct.
of this policy.
Right, all I was trying to understand is if we had an opportunity, like we've still got the court theatre, and I don't know how much is happening there. I don't know how much of that is public. But in terms of if there was an opportunity for council to consider operating an off-street parking building, what would this policy do?
Well, council would simply need to make a decision, a clear decision that they were stepping outside the policy framework that's been adopted here, and that would most likely, I would imagine, be a one-off situation where you would simply state that for whatever reason it was, and it would be a very good reason, no doubt, that council was going to build a car parking building somewhere, which is, although it's outside of the scope of this policy, meets other needs. So it would just be a decision of council.
So we could still make the decision. We would just note that
Absolutely.
it was outside of policy.
This is a policy framework. It's not the constitution.
Yeah. All right. No further questions? Aaron.
Yeah, just a question on 3.2. So the 2015 parking plan was focused on earthquake recovery and ensuring short-term parking availability as the rebuild progressed. I only raised this because it was raised by submitters. 6 years later, and a decade after the earthquakes, a stronger policy direction is now needed to ensure the parking policy...
Please suggesting that time has moved on and we're in a different place we were when we adopted the previous policy.
Yeah, time's moved on, but I think, aren't we still only at like 60% of the people working in the inner city that were there pre-quake?
Well, again, that's just a fact around the 2015 parking plan. It's not making any commentary around the state of the city at the current time or how many people are working in the central city at the current time. That would be well outside of a parking policy. It's just a fact around the 2015 central city parking plan.
Oh, sorry, I thought all the people that worked in the city and everyone that come in shopping, that some of them parked. I'm completely misled here. Got this wrong.
Okay, so have you got questions on the parking policy?
Yep. So then what are the council's priorities and community outcomes we're looking to achieve with this? So what are they, Jake? It's your ward. Will you cover it off in debate?
So I think it goes back to that again. This is a framework for making the decisions based on, for example, the climate change resilience strategy. So the spatial planning, district planning process, and it's about future-proofing it so that when decisions are made, they're taking into consideration our obligations and our goals for the central city. Again, it's not making a specific decision now, and it is allowing for that transition. But this is a way of future-proofing decisions that are made, and also making sure they're consistent across all of the documents and strategies that we have.
And the community outcomes that this would link to would be a livable city, a vibrant and thriving city centre. So that would be one of the community outcomes that we'd link this parking policy to. A well-connected and accessible city, promoting active and public transport. That would be another outcome that we'd link this policy to.
Yes, and all of that aligns, obviously with the council's strategic directions, as you say. That's fine.
Because the claim is sometimes made that we're not that accessible for people using cars. So does that kind of back that up?
So what this policy is trying to do is provide the decision-making framework so that we can ensure that we've got the appropriate type of on-street parking available for the variety of, for wide-ranging users within our community. So that could be people, as you would no doubt be interested in, who have disability. So have we got enough on-street disability car parks? Have we got enough loading zones? Have we got enough short and longer-term stay? So that's the essence of this decision-making framework, the policy that's before you.
Yeah, and the feedback that most councillors that aren't deaf get is that there's people wanting on-street car parking as well.
So further questions?
No.
Andrew.
Yeah. So Aaron, nothing further from you. Phil, yep, I noticed you got your pen up there. Questions?
Thank you. Guys, how many council-owned car parking buildings do we actually run in the city? I know there's a lot that belong to other people. How many do we run?
So answer your question, there are 2 car parking buildings, the Litchfield Street and the outdoor.
So the 4.3 million that we're going to spend over the next 10 years is going to be spent in those 2 car parking buildings alone. Is that fair to say?
4.3 million.
That's in 6.4.1 down the bottom of what Yanni was talking about.
Oh, that 4.3.
Is it the 4.3 about the EV charges?
Installing EV charging facilities.
So that's the work that's got to be prioritised across the city, and we've talked about it at the last council meeting. So that's the team are doing some work this year to prioritise EV charges across the city, not just in council buildings, but at council facilities as well. So it might be metro. There's all sorts.
I can understand that. Yeah, I understand that, Glenn, but it sort of says in council-operated car parking buildings, but that's not quite right, is it fair to say?
So the 4.3 million that's referred to in the last couple of lines, 6.4.1.
Yeah, it should say car park facilities.
So that's car park facilities. It's not just buildings.
Yeah, to be absolutely clear. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
It just seemed like a lot to spend in one place.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so we're done with questions? Okay, so Anne, you'd like to move this? Seconded by Mike. Is there any discussion? Yanni.
Thank you. I appreciate the work that staff have done on this, but I really think it's incumbent on us when we adopt policies that we actually set clear objectives. And if we looked at the Wellington City Council parking policy, what we can see is that they've put some really clear measures. So primary measures including the ratio of residents parking permits to spaces, decrease, number of mobility parks increase, mobility parks designed to meet council guidelines increase, number of car share spaces increase, number of EV charging spaces increase. There's some clear measures around what can be done. And the other one that I found really interesting reading the Wellington parking policy is that one of their key things is to maintain or increase retail spend. And so part of their objectives is to recognise that in the inner city, we do want to support businesses, and that's a really important part of the changes that we make around parking. So in my view, the parking policy that we're adopting, it just lacks clear measurables, and I think that's a real concern. So I'm not going to be supporting it. I would much rather see a clear framework by which we could measure these policies when we adopt them so we know whether they're successful or not. I do want to raise concern around the technology, because what we heard from some submitters was that they are really concerned at how some of the private car parking operators operate. They operate without a lot of social responsibility, and there's a whole bunch of horrific stories. If you look online, for example, in Wellington, there was one of the main companies, Wilson's, had to divest private car parking buildings because they were found to be engaged in anti-competitive behaviour. So I guess it's a bit of a fundamental philosophical view, but I think council should actually own off-street car parking buildings. I think there is a public good that comes with that and a social responsibility you get from that compared to, say, the private operator that we see. And certainly I don't want to adopt a policy that says that we shouldn't be doing off-street car parking buildings because actually if you talk to people about their experience, it does have a negative impact on people's well-being the way in which they're treated from these private operators who don't have any regulations about how they can actually do what they do, and it hurts our people. So, I just wanted to express concern with this policy, that this is really about saying, let's leave it to the private sector. This is a real concern, and I think what's really important is that we put measures and mechanisms in place to make sure that we're monitoring against a clear set of objectives which balance the need to deal with the parking issues in our city, but also recognise the importance of small and local business activity as being really important. And I'm concerned that this policy doesn't even mention that as a key objective.
Thank you. Any further comment? Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Lyle. Thank you very much for the work. It's a good start, and we go forward, and it's excellent. So thank you very much for your replies to councillors' questions. I think that we're very lucky that we have private operators. So I think when we looked at the shingle car parks, all up, I think there was 98 car parks which weren't ours. We'd be bankrupt if we were running private and had that many car parks. So I think we should be sticking to our knitting.
All right, so Sarah.
Thanks, and thanks to Anne for coming up with the Chair's recommendations there, because I know that it was not an easy panel. And I just want to say that our transport staff have the most amazing sets of data. Not all of it always comes in front of us, but the bi-monthly transport report that comes to us and other things that we've seen as evidence over time shows that there are really, really clear sets of data on a wide range of things when it comes to parking availability and use and occupancy and all of those kind of things. The use of our loading bays, a whole range of things. And I think that this parking policy weighs up a range of things, and what it doesn't do is say that we need to be a business. It says that we need to be a council that provides some car parking to enable things in key areas, but also that we need to weigh up the various uses, so mobility parks, loading bays for businesses, taxi ranks, all of those kind of things, as well as spaces for other modes. At some point, we will need to look, as Tim said, as to whether we end up using some on-street space for electric vehicle charging. They do in places like Melbourne. That's not a place we're at yet. It will come eventually, but we're not there yet. But I'd like to ask people to approve this today, knowing that the policy settings in here help both businesses in town get parking turnover, get loading bays and things done, but also start to address the policy settings that are needed to encourage some mode shift and help with climate change. Thanks.
So, Aaron.
Yeah, there's a number of different submissions. There was some of the property owners in the inner city questioned why we were doing this again so soon. Something that's been overwhelming feedback from the public in various phases since the earthquakes has been people don't like how much we've changed some aspects of the inner city. They find it inconvenient to use, and so that's if we're to listen to those ratepayers and citizens of our city, often they tell us the opposite of what we're doing, and I think we should be listening to them more often. Does this achieve what a lot of those people want? I don't think it does, and I think it tries to achieve other goals that only some people want, not necessarily everyone, and it's about getting a balance for a city. So I agree with most of the points that Yanni raised. I think they were pretty good points, and certainly there are members of our public that think the council should own some of the public car parking buildings, so I agree with that. But one of the things about parking buildings is there's people in Christchurch that have phobias about parking buildings and choose not to use them. And when they come to the city and they can't find parking near where they want to go, they choose not to come back again. So that is a behaviour. We can say it doesn't exist and live in an alternate reality, but the reality is, and the numbers stack up, that town is not as busy as it once was. And there's aspects of this inner city that are fantastic, and it should be very, very busy. And when you visit other cities around this country, you see what an inner city that's thriving can look like. And I look forward to hearing what the councillor for the ward that this affects has to say.
Anne.
Yeah. Just to conclude, that to remind people that this policy provides a framework that allows flexibility for the issues, those issues that Yanni and Aaron have raised, to be addressed through operational decisions that will be made by staff after guidance from us as council.
Thank you. Mike.
Just quickly, and I do want to acknowledge Anne for chairing the hearings panel. It was an interesting hearings panel to be on. A very good, diverse set of views and opinions, which was actually quite good and healthy, I think, for democracy. And I acknowledge the recommendations that you've put forward. I think they're excellent. I think we just need to remember that, this is a framework. It will set the direction of what we want to do when we're sort of making the decisions around car parking spaces. But, the main focus is the on-street car parks, not the off-street ones. And as a city within the central area, we have nearly 6,000 on-street car parks, and actually only 1,200 of them are metered. So, we have a substantial amount of on-street free car parks. But what we need to make sure is actually we utilise those car parks to what the best use for them are, and that may be mobility, that may be short-term turnover car parks for businesses, it could be loading zones, etc., etc. So this is what this framework does. It clearly states that in the framework. Some of the comments that are made that, we're trying to turn people off from coming to the cities. It's not true. You can come into the city any means you like. There's access points all over the place. It's easy. There's plenty of car parking when you look at both what the council provides, which is only about 20%, and the private sector, which manage 80% of the car parking. So it's a shame when we constantly hear from some of our colleagues negative points, when actually there's a lot of positive things happening within our CBD. The people I talk to as well, actually, that come in, actually love what's happened in our CBD. They enjoy walking around the promenade, and a lot of them come in by car. And actually, because they know where the car parking spaces are, they have no problem. So instead of, telling people you can't get into the city, why don't we actually be a little bit more happy about the city and actually tell people that it's actually easy to get in here and there's plenty of car parks, because Christchurch is becoming a great city, and this will actually help make sure that we can get the right type of turnover of cars, the right type of car parking, whether it's outside business, outside residential. So I see no reason why anybody would actually say no to this policy.
All right, so I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? So that's Aaron and Yanni against. And James Goff also against. And Phil Major also against. All right, so if we can just note that, and that's carried. Thank you. Okay, item 18, Christchurch Northern Corridor downstream effects bus lane trial, request for time extension.